Interdependence and adaptation are two key ideas that you should be familiar with from Key Stage 3. You should hopefully know that organisms are living things, the environment is somewhere where they live, and population refers to how many of something there is in that environment. We're going to look a little bit at competition and see how this affects populations. Organisms need certain things from their surroundings in order to be able to survive. And often animals will compete for food, mates and territory, whereas plants will compete for light, water and nutrients. Some organisms might have adaptations that allow them to survive in the conditions where they live. Organisms that are best adapted are often the ones that will survive and increase their numbers. If something has an extreme adaptation, we call this an extremophile. This means they might have higher tolerances for certain things, and so they can cope with the specific features of their environment. You can often be asked about extremophiles living in dry or Arctic environments, and we'll look at a couple of examples of these. Advantageous adaptations for the camel include being able to go without food and water for long periods of time, storing fat in their humps as a long-term food reserve, and allowing for heat loss by the fat being distributed around the body. Because they are tall and thin, this also increases their surface area to volume ratio, so how much surface they have versus their volume, which increases heat loss by radiation, which is better for keeping them cool. The advantageous adaptations that a polar bear has are thick fur and fat to insulate it, keep it warm, having large furry feet to distribute their weight as they walk on thin ice so they don't crash through it, their white fur acting as camouflage which helps them hunt, and also in this case actually reducing their surface area to volume ratio to reduce heat loss, the opposite to the camel. You could also be asked about extremophiles in terms of plants. If they're adapted to a dry environment, then there may be changes to the surface area of the leaves, changes to their water storage tissues, and they may also have extensive root systems, so roots that spread out. Again, looking at the dry and Arctic plants, in the desert, cactuses, for example, require very little water to survive. The spines act as a defense against any predators, any animals, and they also have a smaller surface area which reduces water loss. Another thing that reduces water loss is a thick waxy coating, and they have fewer stomata, the part of the plant where water is lost from. We also mentioned the extensive root systems. The roots in a cactus tend to spread sideways, so they will spread out and be able to collect water more easily. The Arctic plants are small and grow close to the ground and close together to avoid the wind. Some will have a light fuzzy covering to insulate the buds so that they can grow. The colours tend to be dark so that they can absorb the heat even in winter. And they grow very slowly because of the cold and short growing seasons. Some of them might in fact grow for up to 10 years before they make any buds for reproduction. As well as plants and animals, you could be asked about the adaptations of microorganisms. There are a few listed here. Changes in the environment can affect the distribution of living organisms, how many of them there are in a certain environment. These changes can be non-living factors or abiotic factors, such as the amount of light available, the amount of oxygen, the amount of water available, or the temperature. Or they might be living or biotic factors, such as the availability of food, whether there are predators, whether there is the opportunity for animals to graze, whether disease affects the population, and the competition that we mentioned earlier. In a similar way to how living biotic and non-living abiotic factors can affect a population, living and non-living organisms can also be used as indicators of pollution. A common example of living organisms being used to indicate the levels of pollution is the use of lichens. Lichens are found attached to tree trunks and rocks and are very sensitive to changes in air quality, in particular the levels of sulfur dioxide. Sulfur dioxide is released from industry and burning fossil fuels, and the lichens will absorb sulfur dioxide dissolved in water, so sulfur dioxide dissolved in water being acid rain. The acid rain actually destroys the chlorophyll in the lichen, which prevents it from photosynthesizing, and this will actually kill the lichen eventually. So that means that some species of lichen only grow in non-polluted air, some species will grow in polluted air, and therefore looking at the type of species can give you an idea of the air pollution. Invertebrate animals, so animals without spines, are also sensitive to changes in concentration of dissolved oxygen in water. So now rather than air pollution, we're discussing water pollution. When pollutants are released into lakes and rivers, the oxygen concentrations decrease. Certain invertebrates will survive in low oxygen, certain will only survive in higher oxygen. And so, just like with the lichens, comparing the types of invertebrates that you have can give you an idea of the water pollution levels. There are also non-living or abiotic indicators, such as oxygen levels, temperature and rainfall, and scientists monitor these factors in order to look at trends or patterns in environmental changes over time. Hopefully you should be familiar with the idea of food chains from Key Stage 3. By looking at food chains, we can see what happens to energy as it passes along the chain, and also something called biomass. The sun is the source of energy for most communities of living organisms, and the sun is captured by green plants and algae, and through photosynthesis, this energy is then stored in the substances that make up the cells of the plants. A food chain, as we have said in Key Stage 3, is a diagram to represent feeding relationships between living things and shows the direction of energy flow, so what is eaten by what, which is indicated by arrows. In the example we have here, an oak tree is eaten by a caterpillar is eaten by a blue tit, and a blue tit is eaten by a sparrowhawk, so this is the direction that the arrows would go in a food chain. You're probably more used to seeing it lined up like this though, which is a better way of drawing your food chain. The amount of energy is reduced at each stage in a food chain because some materials and energy are lost as waste materials, and respiration supplies the energy needed for living processes such as movement and growth. Biomass is just the mass of living material, so it's kind of like the mass that would be left once all water was removed from an organism, from a living thing. You might be familiar with pyramids of number from Key Stage 3. In this example here we would have one sparrowhawk eating a number of blue tits, which would eat a number of caterpillars, but those caterpillars would all survive on one oak tree. So a pyramid of number doesn't always end up as a pyramid shape. However, a pyramid of biomass will always be pyramid shaped. This is because the mass of living material, or biomass, at each stage in a food chain is always less than it was at the previous stage. We mentioned waste materials as being one way that energy is lost as you go along a food chain. And these waste materials, such as trees shedding their leaves and animals producing droppings, can then be decomposed by microorganisms so that the material can be used again by plants. This means the same material is recycled over and over again. Materials can be returned to the environment as waste materials or when living things die and they decay. Materials will decay because they are broken down or digested by microorganisms known as decomposers, and this will happen much faster in warm, moist conditions. It will also happen faster when there is plenty of oxygen, so this is aerobic conditions where oxygen is available and the microorganisms can be more active. The decay process makes up just one part of the carbon cycle, which is the constant cycling of carbon or carbon dioxide in an ecosystem. The carbon cycle highlights where carbon dioxide is released and where carbon dioxide is absorbed. Carbon dioxide is released through decomposing dead organisms. Carbon dioxide is released when animals breathe out carbon dioxide as a waste product. Carbon dioxide is absorbed in photosynthesis. It is also absorbed by animals when they eat plants that have absorbed carbon dioxide in photosynthesis. You should also be aware that oxygen is given out from photosynthesis. This oxygen can then be used by animals in respiration. It is worth remembering that plants also do respiration, so we'll also use oxygen for respiration, but this is only at night. During the day they are doing photosynthesis, which absorbs carbon dioxide and releases oxygen. At night, plants will use oxygen for respiration, and they will actually release a little carbon dioxide as a product of respiration. This is a written summary of the carbon cycle diagram, where carbon dioxide is being released through respiration and also being released by the decomposers that will feed on the bodies of any dead animals and plants. So this also releases carbon dioxide. Something that wasn't on the diagram is the release of carbon dioxide through combustion or burning. We said that carbon dioxide is removed from the environment by photosynthesis. The carbon dioxide that is used in photosynthesis is actually used by the plants to make carbohydrates, fats and proteins which make up the body of plants and algae. We also mentioned how the carbon dioxide in green plants and algae can be absorbed as they are eaten by animals. The final point from the carbon cycle diagram was that some of the carbon dioxide that is taken in during photosynthesis is returned to the atmosphere when green plants and algae respire at night. The final section of this video is about evolution. We've already mentioned how certain animals having certain characteristics can enable them to survive better in terms of adaptations, and evolution is a discussion of how over time these adaptations may lead to an entirely new species. Darwin's is the most widely accepted theory of evolution and states that by natural selection we now have species that have evolved from simple life forms that first developed more than 3 billion years ago. A common exam question might ask why the theory of evolution by natural selection was only gradually accepted. This is partly because it challenged the idea that God made all the animals and plants. It was a different idea to this. At the time there was insufficient evidence or not enough evidence, so Darwin was unable to convince many scientists. And he couldn't scientifically explain how inheritance and variation worked. An alternative theory of evolution, which we now know to be incorrect, was put forward by Lamarck. This incorrect theory was based around an idea of acquired characteristics. So Lamarck argued that an individual's characteristics will change over its lifetime due to amount of use. The example he used for this was giraffes' necks getting longer as those stretched for leaves. He then suggested that these characteristics could be inherited. This idea of use and disuse is incorrect, and actually more giraffes having longer necks can be explained by natural selection, whereby the giraffes that genetically had longer necks were more able to get the food and therefore were more likely to survive and reproduce. Those with the shorter necks were less likely to get food and less likely to reproduce. We now know that Lamarck's theory is incorrect because changes in the body due to environmental factors do not change the genes, and it is the genes that get passed on rather than any changes to the body. Darwin developed his theory of evolution by studying classification, which is looking at the similarities and differences between living things in order to sort them into groups. These models then allowed him to suggest relationships between organisms, and something called an evolutionary tree can help us see those relationships. The tree indicates how long ago the ancestors of an ape species diverged from each other, separated out from each other, and indicates that humans share a common ancestor with chimpanzees more recently than with any other ape species. It therefore means that we share a common ancestor, we go back to the same thing as chimpanzees originally evolved from, but we are not directly evolved from chimpanzees themselves. Darwin's theory of natural selection is that every organism, every living thing produces large numbers of offspring, and individual living things within a species will show a range of variation because of the difference in their genes. In the example here you can see we have some green beetles and some brown beetles, so there is variation in that species. Earlier in this video we mentioned the struggle for all living things to exist, the competition that they face, such as predators. Individuals with characteristics that are best suited to the environment are more likely to survive and therefore are more likely to breed. In the example we can see here, predators such as a bird are easily able to spot the green beetles and eat these. Therefore, the brown beetle has a characteristic better suited to the environment, it is camouflaged, therefore it is more likely to survive and breed. These successful genes, the genes that cause the beetle to be brown and camouflaged and able to survive, are then passed on to the next generation. So over time this will result in a change in the characteristics of a species, in this example more brown beetles being around than green beetles. The variation within a species can be explained by mutations. Mutations occur when there is an error in the DNA. This error may occur when chromosomes are separated during cell division. Because our genes control the synthesis of proteins, the making of proteins, a change in a gene, an error when the DNA is being replicated, can result in different proteins being made. This can change a characteristic. So in our example, a mutation might have led to some of the beetles being brown rather than green. In previous topics, we'll have looked at how mutations can be harmful or fatal. Things like Huntington's disease and cystic fibrosis are caused by mutations. However, in natural selection, sometimes a mutation can actually be useful. If it gives rise to a useful characteristic, so for example, a beetle being brown and camouflaged, then there might be a rapid change in that species as more of the brown beetles breed